If someone you loved was lying in a coma right now, you would probably assume they were somewhere else, gone, unreachable. That assumption might be the most confidently wrong belief in modern medicine. Because the last 10 minutes of a coma may be the most active 10 minutes of the human brain's entire life. For most of medical history, a coma was treated as a light switch, on or off, present or absent. A patient either woke up or they didn't, and in between there was nothing worth studying because there was supposedly nobody home to study. Doctors would stand at the bedside, check reflexes, shine a light in the eyes, and write down a number on a scale that was really just a polite way of saying, "We don't know what's happening in there." For decades, that was the entire science of consciousness, a shrug with a chart attached. Then, in 2006, a neuroscientist named Adrian Owen ran an experiment that should not have worked. He had a patient, a 23-year-old woman, who had been in a car accident and diagnosed as vegetative. By every clinical measure available at the time, she was unaware. No response to voice, no response to pain, no flicker of recognition in her eyes. Owen put her in an fMRI scanner anyway and asked her to imagine two things. First, playing tennis. Then, walking through the rooms of her own house. In a healthy brain, those two thoughts light up completely different regions. Tennis activates the motor cortex, the part that plans movement. Walking through a house activates the parahippocampal gyrus, the part that maps space. They are not subtle differences. They are two entirely separate signatures. When Owen asked the vegetative woman to imagine tennis, her motor cortex lit up. When he asked her to imagine walking through her house, a different region lit up instead, exactly where it should. Her brain was not idling. It was following instructions. It was, in every measurable sense, listening. This wasn't a fluke. Owen and his team went on to test dozens of patients diagnosed as unconscious, and a meaningful fraction of them, somewhere around 1 in 5, showed the same thing. A brain quietly doing what it was asked, wrapped inside a body that could not tell anyone it was doing it. A few years later, Owen's team pushed the idea further. If a patient's brain reliably produced one pattern for tennis and a different pattern for a house, then tennis could mean yes, house could mean no. They started asking these patients real questions. Is your father's name Alexander? Do you have any brothers? The answers came back correctly, encoded entirely in which region of the brain lit up. A person the medical system had classified as unconscious was answering questions about their own family, using nothing but the shape of their thoughts, because that was the only channel left open to them. Here's what makes that so unsettling. These patients had been examined by trained doctors, multiple doctors in multiple hospitals, using the standard tools medicine had at the time. And the standard tools missed them completely. Not because the doctors were careless, but because the entire test for consciousness was built around the body, when the thing it needed to be testing was the brain. So if awareness can hide behind a completely unresponsive body, the real question becomes, how much awareness and for how long? And that's where the story gets stranger. In Liège, Belgium, a research group led by neurologist Stephen Loray began mapping something they called the borderline of consciousness. Not a clean line between aware and unaware, but a gradient, with patients sliding along it in ways that didn't match how they looked from the outside. Loray's team found cases of what's now called cognitive motor dissociation. Patients who could not move a single muscle on command, who registered as vegetative on every bedside exam, but who showed the same brain response Owen had found. Command following, imagery, even basic arithmetic, happening entirely inside a body that gave no outward sign of it. Some of these patients had been lying in that state, invisible to the people around them, for years. Now here's the part almost nobody talks about, because it's the part that raises the hardest question in the entire field. If a person can hear, understand, and think for years without any way to signal it, What is actually happening in the final minutes before they either surface back into the world or slip further away from it? Is that transition sudden, or is it the end of something that's been building the entire time? In 2007, a different team, led by neuroscientist Nicholas Schiff and ethicist Joseph Fins, tried something that sounds almost absurd. They took a man who had been in a minimally conscious state for 6 years, following a severe brain injury, and implanted electrodes deep into a structure called the central thalamus. The thalamus acts like a relay station, the switchboard that decides which signals from the rest of the brain are strong enough to reach conscious awareness. In an injured brain, that switchboard can go quiet, even when the lines feeding into it still work. They turned the current on. Within days, the man began responding to simple commands. Within weeks, he was forming words again, for the first time in 6 years. His mother described hearing his voice and not recognizing it. Not because it had changed, but because she had stopped expecting to hear it at all. That case suggested something the field is still working through today. A coma, or a state near it, might not always be the brain going dark. Sometimes it might be the brain's own switchboard getting stuck in the off position, with everything upstream of it still intact, still waiting. There's another detail buried in this research that rarely makes it into any headline, and it might be the strangest one of all. Even in patients who show none of the imagery response Owen found, brain monitoring has picked up something else entirely: a working circadian rhythm. Electrical activity that rises and falls on a roughly 24-hour cycle, matching day and night. Matching a schedule nobody in the room is enforcing. A body with no measurable awareness, no response to voice or pain, is still quietly keeping time. Something in there is still tracking whether it is day or night, long after every other visible sign of a person seems to have gone dark. Which brings us back to that 10-minute window, the period right at the edge, where a brain is either finding its way back to that switchboard or losing the last connection to it entirely. Researchers monitoring patients during this transition have documented brief, sometimes dramatic surges in electrical activity, bursts of coordinated signaling across regions that had been quiet for a long time. In some patients moving toward recovery, this surge appears to precede the first outward sign of awareness by minutes, sometimes longer, as if the brain reconnects internally before it manages to reconnect to the outside world at all. In patients moving the other direction, toward the point where recovery becomes unlikely, a different kind of activity has been recorded. Not silence, something closer to the brain making one last attempt to reach across a gap that has become too wide to cross. Neither pattern was expected. For most of the last century, medicine assumed a dying or deeply unconscious brain simply ran down, the way any depleted system runs down. Power falling, activity fading, until there's nothing left to measure. What the monitoring has actually shown, in case after case, is closer to the opposite. Activity that intensifies, briefly, right at the edge, before it either stabilizes into recovery or stops. There's a complication here that deserves to be said plainly, because it's the part research has not settled. A brain signal is not the same thing as an experience. Detecting organized electrical activity in the thalamus, or a burst of coordinated signaling across the cortex, tells us the machinery is doing something. It does not tell us whether there is a person inside that moment, aware of anything at all. Some researchers argue this activity is the neurological residue of a system trying to restart, nothing more, the biological equivalent of a server rebooting. Others argue that if the same regions responsible for awareness in a healthy brain are the ones lighting up, it's hard to justify assuming there's nobody home. Neither side has enough evidence to close the question, and anyone who tells you it's settled is telling you more than the data actually supports. What we do know is this: Families are told, more often than they should be, that a loved one in this state is not there anymore, fully gone, nothing left to reach. Owen's tinnis experiment, Laurie's borderline mapping, and Schiff's thalamic work all point to the same uncomfortable correction that certainty is not something medicine has actually earned. Some of the people behind that unresponsive face may be tracking every word said in the room. Some may be working, silently and without any way to show it, back toward the surface. So if someone you loved was lying in a coma right now, and you assumed they were somewhere else, gone, unreachable, the honest answer is nobody can tell you that with certainty. Not their doctor, not the machine measuring their brain. What we can tell you is what the last 20 years of this research keeps circling back to. A body that gives nothing away is not proof of a mind that has gone quiet. Somewhere behind that stillness, a circadian clock may still be counting the hours. A memory of a father's name may still be sitting there, waiting for someone to ask the right question the right way. And in the final minutes, whichever direction they're heading, the brain does not appear to fade out gently like a light on a dimmer switch. It appears to reach, one last time, for a connection it may or may not manage to complete. We used to think a coma was silence. It might be closer to a person shouting into a room built with no way for anyone to hear them. And we are only just now learning how to listen.